November 22nd, 1931. The Cotton Club, Chicago. The most exclusive speakeasy in the Midwest was packed with gangsters, politicians, and socialites celebrating Thanksgiving with the kind of party that only happened when Al Capone was paying the bills. Capone was at the peak of his power, controlling bootlegging operations across the entire region, commanding an army of over 700 men, and generating revenue that exceeded most legitimate businesses in America. At 32 years old, he was the undisputed king of Chicago crime, a celebrity whose fame extended far beyond the criminal underworld. Sitting at a corner table, nursing a glass of bourbon and observing the festivities with quiet dignity was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, visiting Chicago on business that had nothing to do with Capone's operations. Bumpy was 24 years old, still building his reputation in Harlem, but already known among criminal circles as someone who commanded respect through intelligence rather than intimidation. What happened that night would be remembered for decades as the moment when Al Capone learned that some insults carry consequences that last longer than empires, and when Bumpy Johnson proved that the most devastating responses don't require violence, they require understanding exactly where to apply psychological pressure. But how does one comment about a facial scar destroy the confidence of the most powerful gangster in America? What did Bumpy Johnson say to Al Capone that made him spend the rest of his life hiding behind shadows, makeup, and carefully angled photographs? And why did a man who'd survived assassination attempts, federal prosecutions, and gang wars become so ashamed of his appearance that he refused to be seen in public without covering his face? The answer reveals something about power that most people never understand. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't what you can do to someone's body. It's what you can do to their self-image when you understand exactly which insecurity to exploit. To understand how Bumpy Johnson's response to Al Capone's mockery changed the course of both their lives, you need to understand what led to the confrontation and why Capone thought he could humiliate someone who'd already survived more violence than most men could imagine. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson had acquired his famous scar during a knife fight in Harlem when he was 19 years old. A jagged line that ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, a permanent reminder of a night when he'd chosen to defend a friend rather than walk away from trouble. The scar had never bothered Bumpy. If anything, he'd learned to use it as an asset. A visual reminder to anyone who met him that he was someone who'd faced serious violence and survived it. In Harlem, scars were badges of honor. Proof that you'd been tested and hadn't broken under pressure. But Al Capone saw things differently. Capone's own scars, 3 parallel lines on the left side of his face, souvenirs from a bar fight in his youth, were a source of deep insecurity and shame that he'd spent years trying to hide through careful positioning, strategic lighting, and when necessary, makeup applied by professionals who understood how to minimize their appearance in photographs. Capone had built his public image around the idea that he was untouchable, invulnerable, a man who controlled events rather than being controlled by them. His scars contradicted that image, serving as visible reminders that he'd once been vulnerable enough to be cut by someone else's blade. November 22nd, 1931, 11:47 p.m. Al Capone had been drinking for 3 hours, celebrating another successful year of bootlegging operations that had made him the wealthiest criminal in American history. The Cotton Club was filled with his associates, political allies, and business partners, all gathered to demonstrate their loyalty and share in his success. Capone noticed Bumpy Johnson sitting alone at his corner table and decided to demonstrate his dominance by publicly humiliating the young visitor from New York. It was the kind of power play that Capone had perfected over years of establishing his authority through intimidation and public displays of superiority. "Hey, Scarface!" Capone shouted across the crowded club, his voice carrying over the jazz music and party conversation. "I'm talking to you, the ugly one in the corner." The Cotton Club went silent. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned to look at the confrontation developing between Chicago's most powerful crime boss and the quiet stranger who'd been observing the party without participating in it. Bumpy Johnson looked up from his bourbon glass with the calm expression of someone who'd been insulted by experts and wasn't impressed by amateur efforts. He didn't stand up, didn't raise his voice, didn't show any sign of anger or offense. "You talking to me, Chicago?" Bumpy replied quietly, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room. Capone stood up, swaying slightly from the alcohol, encouraged by the attention of his audience and convinced that he was about to demonstrate his superiority over someone who couldn't possibly match his power or influence. "Yeah, I'm talking to you, ugly," Capone said, his words slurred but his intention unmistakable. "What happened to your face? You run into a meat grinder?" You look like someone tried to carve a turkey and used your head for practice." Laughter erupted from Capone's associates, the nervous kind of laughter that comes when people feel obligated to find their boss's jokes amusing regardless of their actual humor. The mockery was cruel, personal, and designed to humiliate Bumpy in front of an audience that would spread the story throughout the criminal underworld. Bumpy Johnson finished his bourbon, set the glass down carefully, and stood up with the deliberate movements of someone who'd just made an important decision. He walked across the room toward Capone's table, his footsteps audible in the continued silence. When Bumpy reached Capone's table, he stopped just close enough for conversation, but far enough away to demonstrate that he wasn't seeking confrontation. He looked directly at Capone with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "Follow," Bumpy said quietly, using Capone's first name with the casual familiarity that immediately established their relationship as equals rather than boss and subordinate. "You got something on your face, too." Capone's hand moved instinctively toward his own scars, the three parallel lines that he'd spent years learning to hide and minimize. "What are you talking about?" Bumpy smiled with the kind of expression that made everyone in the room suddenly uncomfortable. "You got fear on your face, Al? You got shame written across those scars like a book that everyone can read. You spend more time worrying about how you look than most women I know." The room remained completely silent, but the atmosphere had changed from amusement to tension. Capone's associates could see their boss's confidence evaporating in real time as Bumpy continued speaking. "See, my scar," Bumpy said, gesturing casually toward the jagged line on his face, "tells a story about protecting someone I cared about. It reminds me of a night when I chose honor over safety. Every time I look in a mirror, I see evidence that I stood up for what was right." Bumpy paused, letting his words sink in before delivering the response that would haunt Al Capone for the rest of his life. "But your scars, Al. Your scars tell a different story. They tell the story of a man who got cut because he wasn't fast enough, wasn't smart enough, wasn't tough enough to avoid getting marked by someone who was better than him. And the way you try to hide them tells everyone that you're still not tough enough to accept what happened to you." The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Capone's face went pale, his hands began shaking, and his usual aggressive posture collapsed into something that looked like physical pain. "Every time you put makeup on those scars," Bumpy continued, his voice remaining calm and conversational, "you're telling the world that you're ashamed of who you are. Every time you position yourself for photographs to hide the marks, you're admitting that you're still controlled by whoever gave them to you." Bumpy looked around the room at Capone's associates, who are watching their supposedly invincible boss being psychologically dismantled by someone who'd never raised his voice or made a threat. "A real man wears his scars like medals," Bumpy said. "They're proof that he's lived, that he's been tested, that he's survived things that would break weaker people. But Al here treats his scars like evidence of failure, like permanent reminders that he's not as tough as he pretends to be." The final blow came when Bumpy leaned forward slightly and spoke directly to Capone in a voice that everyone in the room could hear clearly. "The difference between your scars and mine, Al, is simple. Mine remind me of my courage. Yours remind you of your cowardice. And everyone who's ever seen you try to hide them knows exactly which kind of man you really are." Bumpy Johnson walked back to his table, finished paying his bill, and left the Cotton Club without looking back. He'd been in Chicago for 2 days on business that had nothing to do with Al Capone, and he'd be gone by morning with no intention of returning. But Al Capone would spend the rest of his life dealing with the psychological damage that Bumpy had inflicted in less than 3 minutes of calm, precise character analysis. November 23rd, 1931. Al Capone didn't leave his hotel room for 18 hours after the Cotton Club incident. When he finally emerged, his face was heavily made up, his scars covered with professional-grade concealer, and his usual confident demeanor replaced with something that looked like barely controlled anxiety. The transformation was noticed immediately by his associates, his enemies, and the journalists who covered his activities. The man who'd built his reputation on being larger than life, who'd courted publicity and reveled in public attention, suddenly seemed desperate to avoid being photographed or seen in well-lit environments. Capone's behavior became increasingly erratic as the psychological impact of Bumpy's words settled into his consciousness. He began scheduling meetings in dimly lit restaurants, positioning himself in shadows and refusing media interviews that had previously been opportunities for him to demonstrate his power and influence. More damaging than the physical attempts to hide his appearance was the way Capone's insecurity affected his decision-making and leadership style. Associates who'd been impressed by his confidence and authority began noticing hesitation, second-guessing, and a preoccupation with appearance that interfered with his ability to focus on business operations. December 15th, 1931. Frank Nitti, Capone's most trusted lieutenant, made a decision that would change the direction of the Chicago outfit. He privately approached several key associates and suggested that Al Capone's leadership was becoming a liability to their operations. The boss hasn't been the same since that Harlem guy embarrassed him at the Cotton Club, Nitti explained during a secret meeting at a warehouse on the South Side. He's more worried about how he looks than how the business runs. That's not the kind of leadership that's going to keep us ahead of the feds or our competitors. The conversation wasn't about betrayal or rebellion. It was about the practical reality that Capone's psychological collapse was affecting their ability to operate effectively. When your leader spends more time worrying about camera angles than strategic planning, the entire organization suffers. January 8th, 1932. Al Capone made a decision that shocked the criminal underworld. He announced that he was stepping back from day-to-day operations of the Chicago outfit, citing health concerns that required him to maintain a lower profile. The announcement was received with skepticism by law enforcement, confusion by the media, and understanding by criminal associates who'd witnessed Capone's transformation from confident leader to insecure recluse. Frank Nitti assumed operational control of the organization while Capone retreated to his estate in Florida, where he could control his environment, lighting, and the circumstances under which he interacted with other people. The most powerful gangster in America had effectively been defeated not by federal prosecutors, rival criminals, or law enforcement pressure, but by a 3-minute conversation that had exposed the psychological vulnerability he'd spent years trying to hide. February 14th, 1932. Exactly 1 year after his retreat from Chicago, Al Capone granted his final newspaper interview to a reporter from the Miami Herald. The interview took place in a dimly lit room, with Capone positioned so that his scars weren't visible, and with ground rules that prohibited photographs or detailed descriptions of his appearance. When asked about his decision to step back from active leadership, Capone gave an answer that revealed how completely Bumpy Johnson's psychological warfare had succeeded. A man reaches a point in his life where he has to decide what's really important. Capone said, his voice lacking the confidence and swagger that had once characterized his public statements. Sometimes the smart move is to let other people handle the spotlight while you focus on other things. The reporter pressed him about rumors that his withdrawal was connected to an incident at the Cotton Club involving a gangster from New York. Capone's response was telling in what it didn't say as much as what it did. "I learned something important that night," Capone said quietly. "I learned that some people see things about you that you don't want them to see. And once they've seen those things, once they've said them out loud where other people can hear them, well, that changes everything." Al Capone died in 1947, 15 years after the Cotton Club incident, having never returned to active leadership of the Chicago outfit. His later years were marked by increasing reclusiveness, paranoia about his appearance, and a preoccupation with controlling how he was photographed or remembered. Bumpy Johnson, meanwhile, returned to Harlem and continued building the empire that would make him the most respected crime figure in New York. He never spoke publicly about the Cotton Club incident, but associates who were present that night said he demonstrated something more powerful than any weapon: the ability to destroy someone's confidence so completely that they never recovered from the psychological damage. The story of Bumpy's response to Al Capone became legendary in organized crime circles, studied by criminals who understood that physical violence was temporary but psychological dominance could last forever. "Bumpy didn't just insult Capone," explained Illinois Gordon, one of Bumpy's most trusted associates. "Years later, he performed surgery on the man's ego. He identified exactly where Capone was vulnerable and then applied pressure so precise that it collapsed his entire sense of self-worth." November 22nd, 1931. The night Al Capone learned that mockery is a weapon that can be turned against its user with devastating effectiveness. The night Bumpy Johnson proved that the most dangerous response to physical insults isn't violence, it's psychological insight applied with surgical precision. The night 3 minutes of calm analysis destroyed years of carefully constructed confidence and sent the most powerful gangster in America into permanent retreat. Al Capone thought he was demonstrating his superiority by mocking Bumpy's scar. Instead, he provided Bumpy with the perfect opportunity to expose the insecurity and shame that Capone had spent years trying to hide from the world. Bumpy Johnson understood something that Capone never learned. Scars aren't evidence of weakness. They're evidence of survival. And men who are ashamed of their survival are men who can be broken by anyone who understands the difference between courage and cowardice. The Cotton Club incident became more than just a confrontation between two criminals. It became a master class in psychological warfare, demonstrating how the right words delivered with perfect timing and complete confidence could be more devastating than any physical weapon. Al Capone hid his face for the rest of his life not because of the scars he'd received in a bar fight, but because of the psychological scars he'd received from someone who understood that the most effective way to defeat an enemy is to make them defeat themselves. Bumpy Johnson's scar remained visible for the rest of his life, worn with pride as a reminder of a night when he'd chosen honor over safety. It became part of his legend, a symbol of his willingness to face danger rather than avoid it. The difference between the two men wasn't in their scars. It was in how they understood what their scars represented. Bumpy saw his as proof of courage. Capone saw his as proof of vulnerability. And that difference determined which man spent his life hiding and which man spent his life leading. November 22nd, 1931. The night Bumpy Johnson taught Al Capone that the most dangerous enemy isn't the one who threatens your life. It's the one who exposes your character. Some wounds heal, some wounds scar. But some wounds reveal truths that change everything about how a man sees himself and how the world sees him. Al Capone never recovered from learning the truth about what his scars really meant. And Bumpy Johnson never forgot the power of helping someone understand exactly who they really were. 3 minutes. 2 men. One conversation that ended an empire and began a legend.
The night Chicago learned that the scars don't make the man, courage makes the man. And shame unmakes him completely.